Nigeria's 2023 general elections are not just of interest to the millions of registered voters, but also to many Africans across the continent. But the interest doesn't stop there. The international community has an eye on Nigeria's elections as well. Truth is, this election is a global affair. As Africa's largest economy and most populous country, the largest black nation on earth, Nigeria is large enough to influence the direction of the entire region based on its own success or failure. But beyond the region, Nigeria's position as the giant of Africa puts the country in the spotlight for these elections. That spotlight has come with observers from across the continent and world landing here in Nigeria. The Independent National Electoral Commission says it has accredited some 146,913 national and international observers for the general elections. This is the largest deployment of domestic and international observers in the history of elections in Nigeria. All of this is tied into the call for free, fair, and credible elections in Nigeria. Joining me now is Joe Kruzich. He is the U.S. Consulate Public Affairs Officer. And we're going to look at that call, the call for free, fair, and credible elections in Nigeria. Joe, thank you so much for joining me on Election Central.
Thank you very much, Tulu, for having me.
So let's start with this. We've seen that there's been some interesting movements in the West African sub-region in the past few years. And despite recent democratic backsliding in the region, Nigeria has enjoyed and recorded 23 years of uninterrupted democracy. How do you think the country can continue to further consolidate on its democratic gains, even when it's in a region that seems to be troubled democratically?
Well, thank you very much, Tulu, for that question. I think the best way for Nigeria to consolidate its democracy is to continue to hold free and fair elections that reflect the will of the Nigerian people. One key area in that is obviously increasing voter participation in elections, because democracies are only as strong as the people who make them up, and it relies upon the participation of all the people of Nigeria. And so it's really important that young people in Nigeria, the disabled, and also women vote in this election. Traditionally, that hasn't been the case in some previous elections in Nigeria, so we're hoping very much that in this election we'll see greater voter turnout amongst those groups especially. But there are other ways in which Nigeria can strengthen its democracy and consolidate it, and they're already taking those steps. We saw the passing of an electoral law last year that was passed by your parliament and signed by President Buhari, and it will guarantee, I think, much better, freer and fairer elections than Nigeria has ever had in the past. INEC, your Independent National Electoral Commission, has also played a key role in ensuring that these elections are free and fair and reflect the will of the Nigerian people. I just want to underline at the start, when I'm talking about our observing of this election, that the U.S. government does not have a favorite candidate or a favorite party in this process. What we care about is the democratic process, and we want to see free and fair elections that reflect the will of the Nigerian people. We also want to see an environment that is free of intimidation and free of violence. And we expect that to happen before the election, during the election, and after the election. So we urge all parties to refrain from violence or intimidation of any kind.
Okay, so I want to say quickly on this before we move on, because with Nigeria being so large, and this is the largest democratic exercise happening on the African continent, we're a democratic country in the midst of other countries that have experienced coups in the past 2 to 3 years. What kind of message do you think it sends when a country such as Nigeria is able to continue to hold on to democracy in the midst of what we've seen in what's been described as a wave of coups in West Africa?
Well, I think it sends a very powerful message, and Nigeria being the most populous and largest nation on the continent of Africa, when they hold democratic elections, it means a lot, symbolically, but also just substantively. And so it's very, very important. And it's not just Africa as well, I mean, or the region, it's global. The eyes of the world are on Nigeria as well. And Nigeria is an inspiration to the rest of the world for holding elections in some would say, very difficult situations. And especially over the last 23, 24 years, they've been consistent in holding free and fair elections that reflect the will of the Nigerian people, and that's a great accomplishment for the Nigerian people and the Nigerian government, and they should be complimented for that.
So what are the U.S.'s expectations for Nigeria's 2023 general election? You've talked about the U.S. not having a favored candidate, just simply wanting the will of the people to be done. But in terms of the expectations, possibly more for the conduct of the elections, what are you looking at?
Well, as I said before, we're looking at the elections and hoping that they will be free, fair, transparent, and reflect the will of the Nigerian people. We're also urging people to resist any acts of violence or intimidation against other people during the election and before the election and after the election. So those are the core standards we have for this. And we've also made pretty clear that if we find people are trying to impede or impede the democratic process in Nigeria, we're willing to take steps against them, especially in banning them from obtaining visas or revoking their visas if they already have it to enter the United States.
And that's going to be a part of the conversation I pick up later. But Joe, tell me, will the U.S. mission in Nigeria be involved in observing these elections? Some 176,000 plus observers. And people are really wondering, what are they coming to do? So let's start with the U.S. mission. Are you guys going to be observing these elections?
We will. We'll have some observers from our consulate in Lagos and our embassy in Abuja going around to polling places both in Abuja and Lagos and in the vicinity of those two cities. And then there are other U.S. delegations that are coming over that also will be observing the elections, one of which is led by our former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Johnny Carson. He'll be leading up a team consisting of a number of high-ranking American officials and celebrities in the United States. And so that they obviously take that job very seriously, and they'll be also fanning themselves all across Nigeria. There'll be other groups, obviously, from the African Union and from Europe as well that'll be observing these elections. We're all, in some ways, coordinating and sharing information and checking in with each other. So, as I said before, the eyes of the world are on Nigeria, but not in a suspicious way, in a supportive way, because we want to make sure that the will of the Nigerian people are reflected in these elections.
And we'll take that. I'm very sure a few Nigerians around, we feel that weight right now. Yeah. But we often hear this phrase, free, fair, credible elections. Yeah. When it comes to some of the key issues you look out for to determine if an election is free and fair and credible, let's walk the audience through that. Because, of course, as you said, there are different observers who are going to be here. The AU has landed with former South African president. We know the European Union is also involved as well, as you mentioned, both the U.S. consulates and then also a U.S. delegation. But in terms of grading, it's almost like a report card. What are we looking out for when it comes to declaring an election free, fair, and credible?
Well, typically when you look at, and I've observed elections in other countries I've served in the past, and typically what you look for there is you go and visit the polling places and you look for any instances of irregularities, or are people having problems voting, are their ID cards, or in this case PVCs being accepted, or that sort of thing. And then you look for, is there any acts of intimidation at the polling places? Are people harassing people as they're coming in or coming out of the polling places, and that sort of thing. And then obviously the reporting of the results is crucial. And I think because of the electoral reform of last year and the electronic reporting of the results from each of the polling stations to the center, that should alleviate quite a bit of the concern there, but not entirely. We'll have to see. But that's another aspect of the not the monitoring, but the observing of the elections.
So you mentioned, of course, that the U.S. is ready and willing to put some kind of sanctions in place for those who might mess with the elections or who might do something around the elections. Right. And we know that last month, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced visa restrictions on specific individuals in Nigeria for undermining the democratic process in a recent Nigerian election. So let's go deeper into that. In terms of the U.S. government imposing similar visa restrictions on actors who undermine the 2023 elections, I want to revisit that point. Is this really where we see things possibly turning out in terms of what the U.S. feels very strongly it can do to actors who might behave this way?
Well, this is one point of leverage that we have with bad actors, and it's not just Nigeria. These rules apply to a number of the whole world actually. The authority for issuing these revoking people's visas or banning them from entering, it comes from the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the INA of the United States law, and it's used, I wouldn't say frequently, but periodically when we see elections that are being impeded by bad actors in those countries. And we, as the Secretary of State said, we concluded recently that there were some Nigerians that we observed trying to impede or obstruct the democratic process in Nigeria in a Nigerian election, and we took action on that.
So in terms of that particular situation, when news of the visa restriction actually broke on social media, many Nigerians wanted to know who the specific individuals were, but that information wasn't made public. So I'll use this opportunity to ask, is there a reason that the names were not made public? Because, okay, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, yeah, there's a very good reason. I mean, because visa records are, under U.S. law, kept confidential, and so we can't reveal those names. But what I can say is that if those individuals had U.S. visas already, we contact them and we tell them that their visas to visit the United States have been revoked.
Interesting. So Nigeria is the giant of Africa. The U.S. is often seen as the big brother of the world. And
Right.
so there's often an exchange, both in terms of economic, bilateral relations and things like that. But a lot of people want to continue to ask in terms of how the U.S. government is helping to strengthen democratic institutions and also promote good governance in Nigeria. What work is being done in that area specifically?
Well, we have a whole slew of activities that we're pursuing with Nigeria and with the whole world. I mean, supporting and promoting democracy is not just a priority we have for Nigeria, it's for the whole world. In fact, the president assembled global leaders recently for the Summit of Democracies, and we're going to have another Summit of Democracy coming up very soon. But in the Nigerian context, so we think, then that the promoting democracy everywhere in the world is vitally important to our national interests as the United States. It's a fundamental value that we think we share with with the whole world, actually, and that people have this innate yearning for freedom and for democracy. So that's a fundamental value that we have in our foreign policy. Now, with respect to Nigeria, we have a whole bunch of programs that support civil society in Nigeria that we conduct through one of our agencies, the USAID, which provides a lot of assistance for promoting democratic programs throughout Nigerian society, whether aiding groups that I talked about earlier, women and disabled and youth, and getting them to and promoting their participation in the democratic process through a number of different programs, through campaigns, but through grants and stuff that we give to NGOs in Nigeria that encourage that process. We also, in the public affairs section at the Consulate in Lagos, have done a number of programs with the media, a number of training programs with the media across southern Nigeria in collaboration with the West African Broadcasting Bureau. And it was very effective in terms of helping journalists in the states around southern Nigeria to understand the ways in which to spot disinformation and also how to cover elections that are sometimes fraught with violence, sometimes fraught with very serious challenges of intimidation, how to cover those issues.
All right, Joe, before I finally let you go, in terms of a final message, we're probably less than 72 hours now. It's no longer a count of days. It's a count of hours that we've entered now, the final stretch of this race. What's your final message to Nigerians as 93 million plus of them head to the polls on Saturday?
Well, I have a couple. One is that, as I said at the start, your democracy is only as strong as the people and how much they care about their democracy. So one key aspect of that is you have to vote. You need to vote and make your voice heard. We in America learned this lesson in 2020, that you can't take your democracy for granted. And so I would urge the Nigerian people not to take the their democracy for granted, but go out and vote, make your voice heard. It's your right, it's your privilege to be able to vote in a democratic society. And that's very important, and I want to underline that. The second thing is that it's very important that Nigeria understand that the eyes of the world are on Nigeria for this election this weekend, and in a supportive way. We take inspiration from what Nigeria is doing in the last 23 years of uninterrupted democracy, and we have all the faith in the Nigerian people that they will make wise choices on Saturday.
And we'll leave it at that for now. I know that there's still a lot of more plans and things to put into play and action before Saturday. But I do say a very big thank you to you, Joe, for joining me today on Election Central.
Thank you very much for having me.